This is part 7 of the Kyosho Lazer ZX6 build series, and I want to give you my thoughts on how the build has gone, and my generic thoughts on the kit and what you're actually getting for your money and so on and so forth. So first about the actual build itself. The instruction manual, I'd say, is somewhat improved over that of the ZX5. Although I don't completely remember the ZX5 manual because, again, it's been about 2 years since I built that buggy. But what I found is that if you really take your time with it and measure out every single screw and have, some little tackle boxes to organize all the parts, it's actually not bad. But it does take time. You cannot slap this kit together in 3 hours or so and expect to run it if you really want to do it right. I know you can do that with the associated kits because the instruction manuals there are a little bit better and their parts organization in the parts bags is much more modular, but you do end up with a lot more waste product on the associated kits, a lot more bags, a lot more plastic that you're throwing out. So I'm willing to forego the extra garbage to have less garbage plastic and have to just spend some time organizing these parts. So that's not too big of a deal for me. But just bear in mind, you do need to take your time with this kit. I'm not pleased with their not including shock oil with the kit. I think they should at least do that because there are less expensive kits that give you the factory shock oil, like Team Associated, Team Losi. They give you a nice fat bottle of their shock oil. They don't do that with Kyosho kits, even though it costs more money. They don't even suggest for you a setup for ride height and shock oil. On the associated kits, on the Losi kits, you get a baseline setup to use for your car. Kyosho does not offer that for this kit. They also did not do that for the ZX5, so that's an area where the manual was not improved. They also need to include in their manual just reminders to the builder to use thread lock on parts where you're screwing into metal parts. So for example here, the hinge pin mounts, that's a metal part, and you're screwing a metal screw into a metal part. They don't tell you to use thread lock there. For the motor mount, they don't tell you to use thread lock there. So they should do that. If you're going to pay big money for a kit like this, you'd expect the manual to have absolutely every last thing you need to understand how to build the kit. And although the manual is pretty good, they don't quite have that. They're not there yet, and that's unfortunate. I do remember the old Lazer ZX manual, the ZXR manual. I'm pretty sure it was overall better in that respect. So for some reason, they've kind of declined in quality. Although I will say from the ZX5 FS2 SP to the ZX6, it is a better manual. On the ZX5 manual, there were actually steps in the manual that were actually wrong. They told you to use the wrong spacer or the wrong screw. It was only like maybe 2 steps or so that had that, but that was a problem. For the ZX6, I did not come across any steps that were actually technically wrong. They were all correct. It would just be nice if some of the steps included more information, like for example the thread lock. That's one example. Okay, so there's that. And what else about the build? Well, the parts are pretty good quality. They're what you would expect from Kyosho. The parts trees is kind of, I'd say that's kind of outdated by now. Other kits that you get with comparable parts quality, like Losi parts quality and associated parts quality, have really come up in recent years. So they're competitive with Kyosho quality in terms of the plastics used. And yet, when they give you parts, they don't include a parts tree with a bunch of parts you're not going to use ever. So one thing that would be nice for Kyosho to start doing is to sell their parts differently. Not only to include them in the box differently, but also when you buy the parts. So for example, I bought a few spares because I do anticipate eventually I'm going to break stuff. Suspension arms. When you get Kyosho suspension arms, you get a parts tree with one front arm and one rear arm. That's always been the case, as far as I can remember. And it's not likely that you'll break a rear arm. It's actually very uncommon. Most of the abuse of the car takes place at the front. So most likely you're going to break front arms. So if you want 2 front arms, you got to buy 2 parts trees. And then you have 2 rear arms that you're probably never going to need. Maybe when the arms wear out, you need to replace them, but otherwise they're not likely to break. So it would be great if Kyosho could include 2 front arms in a parts tree, 2 rear arms in a parts tree. That would be a much more economical use of their resources as well, because they're spending all this plastic making a parts tree to make parts that only, you know, the people will only need some of those parts on the tree. They won't need the whole tree. So that's wasteful on their part, and then ends up costing you money as a consumer for stuff you're never going to use. So they need to improve that. And of course, you know, Kyosho parts being Kyosho parts, they're worth their weight in platinum, so they're going to be expensive. So you're really spending money on that. Okay, so back to the build. Again, you know, not so bad. The diffs are great. They're nice and smooth. I'm not entirely sure why they include 3 diff gears. If you go back to the part of the build series where I talk about building the diffs, there's a 3rd diff gear in there that you actually can't use in this build because the inside hole in that diff gear is too large. It doesn't actually seat the diff bearings. And I think I made this mistake not only on the ZX6, but I believe also on the ZX5. They gave you 3 diff gears, but you only use 2 of them, and the 3rd one is completely useless, at least for this kit. Same thing for the ZX5. If they're going to give me a 3rd diff gear, they should give me a 3rd diff gear that I can actually use, not a diff gear that I'm going to throw out. So they need to do something about that. Otherwise, the diffs themselves are great. They're very nice and smooth. The other thing is with this little plastic collar here that goes over the transmission outdrive to the center drivetrain. I'm not crazy about this plastic collar. It's rather brittle. If you have to cut this little slot here and then sort of, spread it out a little bit and then clamp it onto this drive cup. But if you bend it too much, you break it, and you only get 2 of these, one for the front, one for the rear. You get no spares. So having an O-ring or maybe some other way of clamping this down would be preferable. Maybe if they made this out of metal, for example, that'd be much better. So there's some improvement needed there. What else comes to mind? So now we're getting through the drivetrain. Drivetrain's okay. They do tell you to use grease on parts that you don't necessarily need to use grease on. I kind of referenced this in part 6, and I think one of the other parts of the build, like putting grease on the dog bone end before you slot it into the diff outdrive. That's not entirely necessary. My associated kits and my Losi kits, I don't do that, and the manual never even calls for it. They only call for you to grease the actual CVA joints. Kyosho also wants you to grease these drive cups or drive hubs, whatever you want to call them, for the center drivetrain. You can do that. I know people who don't, and they don't have a problem with it, and that they tell me that greasing it only just flings grease around the inside of the chassis. So it's kind of like Tamiya. Tamiya tends to do this too. Any moving part, they tell you to grease up, even though you don't exactly need to. And it's kind of ironic because they'll tell you to do that, but then when you're screwing metal screws into metal parts, they don't remind you to use thread lock. So their logic is kind of, I would say their logic is a little inconsistent there. Okay, moving forward, we're getting through the drivetrain here. Everything is okie dokie. I do like how they give you options for different battery and motor configurations. That seems to be popular now, so it's good that they're keeping up with the times. The sway bar assembly is a bit wonky. I mentioned this before. You have to cut a hole in one of these ball cups, and they only give you 2 spares, so if you screw this up, you're screwed. And I recommend do not drill this hole. Use a body reamer so you don't generate too much heat and melt this and muck up the inside of the cup. Use a reamer for this, even though they tell you to drill it. Don't be stupid. I don't know exactly why they force you to put a 2mm gap here. If they didn't have that gap, if you set this to 0mm, then you wouldn't even have to drill this hole. and life would be a whole lot easier. So why don't they just cut this shorter, have you make it flush, and then not have to modify this, and everything's easier. Maybe they want you to be able to adjust the position of this ball end along the sway bar, which would be fair. You know, by adjusting the position of this ball end, you're changing the leverage that the sway bar has on the arm. But is this 2 millimeters really going to make a difference? I doubt it. So better to just cut that short and build this like a normal person would. This is kind of overly complex for what you're getting. They need to put longer screws in for these sway bar sort of caps here. The screw is a 3x6. I think it should be a 3x8 because there's still thread space in the front assembly here to do that, and it would help these hold in place better before stripping out. So the sway bar assembly does need some work. Let's see, getting through all the rest of this. Let's see, shocks are great. I have nothing bad to say about the shocks. The electronics mounting, it just sort of is what it is. I use rather large electronics, so there's not a whole lot of space in here. I'm not sure why, because on my B44 I can use similar size electronics for the receiver and the speed control and the servo, and have plenty of space to mount everything with a saddle pack setup. I can imagine that that's probably because the B44 chassis is a little bit wider, and so I have the space for that. More modern chassis that are trying to gear themselves for higher grip surfaces. You want to make the chassis narrow so you have a lower polar moment of inertia. The car responds better. Fine, I get it. But that just does require you to change your battery layout to use larger, clunkier electronics. Okay, so those are my general thoughts on the build. What about the actual kit itself? From a materials perspective, is the kit worth it? Well, what are you getting for your $500 or $600 when you spend on this kit? You're getting Kyosho plastics, which have good quality. You're getting Teflon sealed bearings, which are great. You're getting really, really nice ball discs. Well, they don't only have tungsten carbide diff balls, but just the assembly itself, the smoothness, they're very good. They tend to last a while. So you're getting quality diffs, you're getting amazing shocks, and you're getting a pretty good design. I mean, you could argue this is a lot like a B44, but the main difference that comes to mind for me is the front droop. On the B44, the way that they designed the front diff outdrive and the front, zoom in a little bit here, and the front dog bone is such that at full droop, the dog bone is right at the edge of the diff outdrive, and if you land wrong or if you crash and it just bends the arm a little bit, the dog bone pops right out. So here, I can this amount of droop here is probably about the same as what you'd have on a standard B44 setup, and yet if I go here, there's still plenty of space for the dog bone to reach the end of the diff outdrive. So basically, the way the dog bone and the outdrives are co-designed in this chassis allows me to get more front droop if I want it or need it, so I can land bigger jumps on flat surfaces or whatever. I can land better at the front on this car than the B44 without worrying about the dog bones popping out. So I really appreciate that in this design. Now, is that something you should pay a big premium for? No, I think Team Associated just screwed up, and they should have designed the B44 better to have this, right? I shouldn't have to pay $500 or $600 for this. Any moron should be able to design a front suspension correctly. What else are you getting? You're getting steel turnbuckles, which I'm not crazy about. They should really include titanium turnbuckles. That would better justify the cost of the kit. So the idea that people claim that with a Kyosho kit you're getting more for, you're getting good materials for your money, that's partially true. Okay, you're getting, say, tungsten carbide diff balls, but guess what? Team Associated kits come with tungsten carbide diff balls. You're getting higher quality plastics, but guess what? Team Losi and Team Associated have higher quality plastic compared to what they had before. The B5, the B5M, the B5M Factory Light have way better plastics than the B4 ever had. So you could say the plastics for Kyosho kits and Associated kits and Losi kits are all on par with each other. They all come with carbide diff balls. The Losi kits, the associated, all of them. What about the bearings? Okay, fair enough. Maybe the bearings on the Kyosho kits are better than when you get with a Losi kit or an associated kit. But is that worth a $200 premium? No. That's maybe worth a $40 or $50 premium. Maybe. You're getting better shocks. Okay, is that worth a $200 premium? No. Maybe that's worth 30 or 40 bucks. So, if that, maybe. So from a pure materials perspective, and from what you're actually getting out of the kit, if you break it all down, I'm not entirely convinced that it's worth the money you're spending. You can get something like a 22.4 or a B44 for a lot less money, and you know, add, say, better bearings if you wanted to, add better shocks, and still not be quite at the amount of money you'd spend on a ZX6. So really, you're just paying for the brand name, if I'm perfectly honest. Luckily, I can afford to do so, at least for the time being. So, you know, I'm happy to try it out and let you guys know about it. I think the main thing is they got to include titanium turnbuckles. That would be better. And this kit is actually also more expensive than the ZX5. ZX5 was about $500. This is almost $100 more if you pay full price for it. So, yeah. But still a nice kit. I expect it's going to drive great. So from a driving perspective, you know, it should be just as fast as all the other buggies out there. But then from that perspective, if you're a racer and you want to get the most speed for the money, get a Losi 22.4 or get a B44. They're a lot cheaper and they're just as quick. Between those two, I'd pick the Losi 22.4 because that jumps way better than the B44. Again, the B44 has that front droop problem that they need to address in their next generation four-wheel drive buggy. So that's all I can really remember to say right now. Again, you know, in time I'll have some running videos of this, and you know, I'll have some initial impressions on the drive and all that fun stuff. But for now, this is what I have. These are my thoughts on the build and on the kit and what you're getting for your money. If you're really trying to break it down, it's not worth it from a numeric perspective. But there could be little things here and there that actually make the kit worth having in terms of the design and the way the parts are assembled. Maybe a lot of the reason why the kit costs more is because you're getting, you know, parts trees with plastic parts that you're not using. So all this material that's being wasted costs money. And so maybe part of the added cost of the kit is just all the extra stuff you're effectively paying for but not actually using. So that could be another reason why the kit costs more. So if they can address that problem and only give you the parts you need, they should be able to bring the cost down. Okay, so those are my thoughts, and until next time, thanks for watching.